I didn't say a word when my daughter-in-law told me I was an embarrassment to this family. I just set down my coffee cup, folded my napkin, and walked out of my own kitchen. That probably surprised her. Most people who've known me a long time say I'm not the type to walk away from anything. 41 years running a small electrical contracting business will put some stubbornness in a man. But I've also learned the hard way, the slow way, that the best moves aren't made loud. My name isn't important. What matters is this. I'm 64 years old. I own a 3-bedroom house on a quiet street outside of Raleigh. I paid it off in 2019. No mortgage, no lien, just a deed with my name on it, filed at the Wake County Register of Deeds, clear as daylight. And for about 7 months, I let my son and his wife live there with me because they said they needed help getting back on their feet. I want to tell you how that went. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is, whatever else he became during those months. He married his wife about 3 years ago. I flew out to the wedding, sat in the front row, cried a little, not going to lie. She seemed fine to me then, maybe a little sharp around the edges, but I've known plenty of people like that who turned out to be decent once you got to know them. What I didn't know was that she'd spent the first year of their marriage telling my son that I was the reason they couldn't move forward in life, that I loomed too large, that my calls were intrusive. I found this out later from my son himself in a moment of honesty I don't think he expected to have. When they had financial trouble, his job eliminated, her income not covering their rent in Durham, they asked if they could stay with me. Temporarily. 3 months, they said, just until he found something new. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He's my son. I cleared out the guest room, bought a new mattress, put fresh towels in the hallway bathroom. I told them the kitchen was theirs, the washer and dryer were theirs. Help yourself to whatever's in the pantry. I meant it. I was genuinely glad to have him home for a little while, even if the circumstances weren't great. The first month was fine. We had dinner together a couple times a week. He was applying for jobs, seemed motivated. She was applying for jobs, seemed motivated. She was polite in the careful way people are polite when they're pretending. The second month, things started to shift. She began making comments about the house, little ones at first. This layout is so inefficient. I can't believe there's only one bathroom on the main floor. The kitchen really needs updating. I let it go. People get comfortable. They start talking. I didn't think much of it. Then she started rearranging things. My things. I came home from a doctor's appointment one afternoon and found that the living room had been reorganized. My recliner, the chair I've sat in for 11 years, had been moved to face the wall. She put a decorative bench where it used to be, a bench that didn't belong to me. I moved my chair back. She came out of the bedroom and watched me do it without saying anything. That night at dinner, she told my son, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen, that this living situation isn't sustainable. I kept washing my dish. The third month, her parents started coming around. They lived about 40 minutes away. At first it was Sunday dinners, which I thought was nice. Then it was weekday visits. Then one Saturday I woke up and her father was sitting in my kitchen drinking my coffee and reading a newspaper like he'd always lived there. I introduced myself. He looked at me over the paper and said, "Oh, you must be the father." Like I was a guest in my own house. I poured myself a cup and sat down at my own table and we had a conversation that felt, somehow, like I was being interviewed. He asked me about the square footage. He asked about the age of the roof. He asked whether the HVAC had been serviced recently. I answered honestly because I didn't yet understand what I was answering for. That was my mistake. Not a legal mistake. Just a human one. I trusted the situation too much. Too long. Things moved fast after that. The following week, my daughter-in-law sat me down, like she was my supervisor, and told me that she and my son had been talking, and that they felt it would be better for everyone if I considered moving into a senior living community nearby. I want to be careful how I describe what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder. A kind of clarity. I asked her to repeat herself. She did, She said there was a very nice place about 12 minutes away, had a pool and activities, and that at my age I'd probably be happier somewhere with people my own age. I said, "This is my house." She said, "We know that, and we're so grateful you've shared it with us. But it's getting crowded, and my parents really need a stable environment right now. They've had a hard year." I said, "So have I." She looked at me like I'd said something unreasonable. My son wasn't in the room. I think that was intentional. Over the next few weeks, she kept at it. Not aggressive exactly. That's what made it so disorienting. She was patient about it. Persistent. She'd mention the senior community casually. Leave a brochure on the counter. Send me a link by text with a little message that said, "Just wanted you to have options." She started introducing me to neighbors as my father-in-law who's been staying with us, which I know because one of those neighbors, a woman named Dorothy who lives 2 doors down, told me directly. "She introduces you like you're the visitor," Dorothy said. "I thought you owned that house." "I do," I said. Dorothy looked at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. My son, during all of this, said almost nothing. That was the part that hurt most, if I'm being honest. He'd make excuses to leave the room when things got tense. He'd say things like, "Let's all just get along. And it's a complicated situation, Dad," without ever stating the obvious, which was that it wasn't complicated at all. It was his wife trying to move her parents into his father's house and counting on his silence to make it happen. The morning she told me I was an embarrassment to this family, I'd come downstairs to find her mother standing in my living room measuring the walls, holding a tape measure, writing numbers in a little notebook. I asked what she was doing. She looked up and said pleasantly, "Oh, just getting some measurements. For furniture." I went and poured my coffee. My daughter-in-law came in, saw my face, and made a sound that I can only describe as preemptively defensive. Before I could say anything, she said, "Please don't make this into something. Her parents need to be somewhere stable and this house has more than enough room." I said, "This is my home." She said, "You keep saying that like it means something." That was the moment. Right there. She said it casually, like it was just a mildly irritating thing I did, repeated myself, like, "This is my home," was a nervous tick instead of a legal fact. And I set down my cup, and I folded my napkin, and I walked out of the kitchen. I drove to my attorney's office. I want to be clear about something here, because I think this is the part that people miss when they hear stories like this. I didn't go to my attorney to get revenge. I didn't go in hot. I went because I needed to understand clearly, from a professional, what my options were, what the process looked like, what it would take. My attorney has known me for 20 years. He handled my business contracts, my wife's estate when she passed, a boundary dispute with a neighbor back in 2014. He's a practical man. He listens before he talks. I laid out the whole situation. He asked questions. He took notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know you can just sell the house, right?" I hadn't thought of that. Not to be dramatic about it. But that sentence rearranged something in my head. I didn't have to fight about it. I didn't have to argue my way back into my own kitchen. I owned the house outright. I could sell it to whoever I wanted, whenever I wanted, and there was nothing anyone could say about that, because it was my name on the deed and no one else's. We talked through the process. I had some money set aside, a modest inheritance from my older brother who'd passed 2 years prior, and it had been sitting in savings because I hadn't decided what to do with it. My attorney knew a couple who'd been looking in that area for about a year. Young family, he said, nice people, looking for exactly this kind of property. Single story, good bones, quiet neighborhood. I told him I was interested. Here's what I did not do. I did not tell my son. I did not tell my daughter-in-law. I did not change my behavior at the house, did not pack boxes, did not give any indication that anything was happening. I went about my days as I always had. I fed Dorothy's cat when she was out of town. I had lunch with an old colleague from my contracting days. I went to my regular Tuesday morning men's group at the church. I am not a man who has ever needed to announce himself. The sale moved fairly quickly. 6 weeks from our first conversation to closing. The buyers were flexible on timeline, which helped. We agreed on a possession date that gave me enough time to find an apartment I'd actually been looking at for 2 years. A nice place in the smaller complex near the botanical garden, 1 bedroom, a little patio, a quiet parking lot. I'd always kind of liked the idea of less space to manage, less lawn, less everything that needs maintaining alone. My daughter-in-law, during those 6 weeks, had continued making plans. She'd told her parents they could move in within the month. She'd picked out paint colors. I know because she'd left paint swatches on the kitchen counter with little handwritten notes like master and guest. She'd started redirecting packages to the house, packages addressed to her parents. She'd also, I learned from Dorothy, told several neighbors that the house was going to be refreshed and that she and her husband were going to finally have their own space. Their own space. In my house. That I'd built and paid for over 23 years. I moved out on a Thursday. Quietly. My son was at work. My daughter-in-law was out. I'd arranged for a small moving company. 2 guys, 3 hours to take the essentials. Furniture I wanted to keep. My wife's china cabinet. My tools. My files. Left what I didn't need. Left the kitchen clean. Took out the trash. I left one thing on the kitchen counter, the number for my attorney. The following Saturday, my daughter-in-law hosted what she'd been calling, in her messages to people, a family gathering. I know this because she'd actually invited Dorothy. Perhaps not realizing that Dorothy and I spoke regularly, Dorothy had said she might stop by. I asked Dorothy if I could come with her. She said she thought that sounded like a fine idea. I dressed the way I always dress. Slacks, a button-down, my good shoes. I've never seen the point in being shabby when you can be otherwise. Dorothy drove. We arrived about 40 minutes into the party. My daughter-in-law opened the door. The look on her face when she saw me is not something I'll forget easily. It moved through about 4 stages in maybe 2 seconds. Surprise, irritation, the performance of pleasantness, then something else underneath all of that. Something more like uncertainty. "We weren't expecting you," she said. "I know," I said. I stepped inside. My son was standing near the back wall with a drink in his hand. He went still when he saw me. Her parents were there too. Her mother, the one who'd measured my walls, looked away when I walked in. There were maybe 8 or 10 people in total. Neighbors. A cousin of hers, I think. Someone I didn't recognize. I didn't make a scene. I want to be clear about that because I know how these things can sound when you write them down. I walked in, I said hello to the people I knew. I accepted a glass of water from someone and stood in my living room, my former living room, and I waited for the right moment, which came about 10 minutes later when there was a natural lull in conversation. I said, not loudly, I wanted to stop by and introduce something. My daughter-in-law looked at me. My son looked at me. I took a folded envelope from my breast pocket and set it on the coffee table. "The new owners will be taking possession of this property in 18 days, I said. I had my attorney prepare the official occupancy notice. It's required to be delivered in person, which is why I'm here. The room got quiet in that particular way rooms do when everyone realizes at the same time that something real is happening. My daughter-in-law said, "What?" I said, "I sold the house. The buyers are a young family. Very nice. They'll be needing all occupants to vacate by the possession date." I nodded at the envelope. "The notice is formal and legally binding. I'd recommend you contact an attorney if you have questions about your rights as current occupants, though since you were guests rather than tenants, the process is fairly straightforward." She stared at me. Then she looked at my son. My son stared at the envelope. Her father started to say something, but her mother put a hand on his arm. One of the neighbors near the window cleared her throat and said very quietly, "Should we?" And someone else said, "Yeah, maybe." And within about 4 minutes the room had mostly emptied. Dorothy stayed. She stood near the door with her hands folded, looking calm. My daughter-in-law turned to me and her voice had changed. The performance was gone. She said, "You can't do this." I said, "I already did." "This is our home," she said. I said, "No, it was mine. And I chose to share it with you and my son for 7 months out of love, and that was my right. Selling it was also my right. If there's paperwork you don't understand, the attorney's number's in the kitchen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice I hadn't heard from her before, smaller and genuinely confused, "Where are we supposed to go?" I said, "I believe there's a very nice place about 12 minutes from here. Pool, activities, people in a similar situation." I let that sit for just a second. I'll see myself out. My son followed me to the driveway. I'd expected anger, but what I got was something more complicated. He looked the way he used to look when he was about 12 and had done something he knew was wrong and was trying to figure out how to say so. He said, "Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have said something." I said, "You should have, but you didn't, and now here we are." I put my hand on his shoulder for a moment. "I love you. That doesn't change. But I also spent 40 years building something, and I wasn't going to let it be taken from me just because saying so out loud was awkward for you." He nodded. Didn't say anything else. I think sometimes silence is the most honest thing a person can offer. I got in Dorothy's car and we drove to a diner about a mile away and had pie, lemon meringue for her, pecan for me. We sat for about an hour. She told me about her grandchildren. I told her about the new apartment, the patio, the botanical garden nearby. It was a very good afternoon. The new owners moved in on schedule. Nice couple. She's a teacher. He works in IT. They have a little girl, 4 years old, who apparently ran through the backyard the first weekend screaming with delight about the grass. Dorothy told me that. My son and his wife found an apartment. It took them about 2 weeks, which is about how long it takes when you actually have to. Her parents, untold, are looking at options. I've been in my apartment for about 4 months now. The patio faces east, so I get morning sun, which I like. I've started keeping a small herb garden out there. Rosemary, thyme, a little basil that I'm frankly not sure is going to make it through the summer. I walk to the botanical garden on Tuesday mornings before the church group. My son and I talk on the phone. It's careful conversation still, but it's conversation. I think he's getting there. I think he's beginning to understand that there are moments in a man's life when staying quiet is the same thing as choosing a side, and that choosing wrong has a cost. I don't tell him that. I don't need to. Some things are better just understood slowly, over time. What I will say, for anyone who might be listening and recognizes something of themselves in this, whether you're in the chair being moved or you're the one watching it happen to someone you love, is this: quiet doesn't mean weak. Patient doesn't mean unaware. And a man who smiles and says nothing while you measure his walls is not a man who doesn't notice. He's a man who's deciding when and how to respond. I didn't lose my home. I sold it. Those are completely different things. And I'll take that distinction with me as long as I'm around to enjoy my patio and argue with my basil about whether it wants to live. I think that's everything worth telling.